We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano. I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am very excited to introduce our guest with us today, Pilar Harris. She is the Director of Global Partnerships at Global Citizen. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad to have a spot in the day where we can really connect.
Yes, I'm really happy that we are connecting today as well. If you want to start off with just telling us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and what really drove you to go to Global Citizen.
Yeah, sure. Pilar is my name. Pronouns I prefer she, her, hers. And as we just discussed before we hopped on, I live in Brooklyn, like you do. I am a director of global partnerships at Global Citizen, and I've been in that seat for just over a year. So I started at the organization the week the pandemic hit. And it's been such an incredible ride. I would say I found my way to Global Citizen by way of a lot of the work that I was doing at a previous company around really bringing brands to a better sense of impact and purpose. So working alongside some of the world's biggest brands to really help them tell the story of the good that they're doing in the world. It's something that I'm really, really passionate about, and I get to flex those muscles in my day job almost all the time, which is great.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that's one of the things that we really wanted to talk about today, too, is because I think it is a really unique space to be in for really driving change through brands and organizations and also the private sector, too. I know there are a lot of ways to make change, but what is really driving you to really go this route in terms of working with organizations to ensure that they're making an impact on their community?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that kind of keep me energized in this work. When it comes to looking at how the private sector can have an impact, I just think about the day-to-day life of the average consumer, and how much we interact with brands, whether consciously or unconsciously. So many of the brands that are part of our lives are just that. They're really things that we build around. They're things that we save up for. They're things that we celebrate. And so for me, it's always been important to think about, for companies and brands, beyond profit, like what really is the end game here. And best case scenario is when you've got a strong brand that has a really clear sense of their values and their mission, and they're able to communicate that to their customers well. So I really love that part of the work. I will also say, thinking about this kind of at a more macro level, the private sector is able to have influence and move money much more quickly than governments, for example. And so when we look at the private sector, it's not only a huge opportunity to reach consumers, but it's also a really clear path to kind of forging change quickly. I mean, it can take decades for governments to kind of shift and address the issues that we know are all important. But when you look at the private sector and you see C-suite leaders who are starting to speak up and take on more of an activist posture, right, around things that matter, I just think that the pace of change there is really, really exciting.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. And we know that any kind of change doesn't happen overnight, but if you can move the needle a little bit quicker, I think that is definitely important, and just measuring that progress. And I think we're seeing a lot of organizations really trying to take on more of an activist voice and at least take a stand on really societal issues, corporate social justice. And you mentioned really thinking about the end game too for companies. How do you think that, organizations can really meaningfully engage with the community and have an impact without just throwing money at an organization or a problem, or just being saviors in a space where they might not know the best information?
Yeah. I think there are a few kind of best practices for that. One that I think is super undervalued, and not often prioritized, is just listening. And so, we see companies operate in different communities around the world, and maybe there's an intention to have an impact in those communities.
Mhm.
I think there is sometimes a top-down approach where the company says, here is what we have for you. Here's what we're willing to do for you as a community. We're going to write this check. we're going to sponsor this initiative. Maybe there's
Mhm.
scholarships that are happening as a result, right? And that's one way to do the work. But I think where you see companies really build relationships with communities, those relationships can stand the test of time if the companies are actually listening to what the community needs, right? And so it could be the case that scholarships are lower priority than something like access to basic health services, right? I think it's
Right.
different in every community, but really having a value for listening and understanding what the needs are, I think is so, so, so important. Um, I think another way that companies can really meaningfully engage is by activating their employees, right? I think you're starting to see more employee engagement around social justice related issues. And I think certainly for folks of color in the workplace, we've kind of always been aware that there are people like us at work who are talking about the things and really grappling with some of these social issues that maybe aren't a part of our business meetings, right? And so I think giving employees the opportunity to really shout about the things that they care about, to really tell the story of how they're directly impacted by things is super, super powerful. And what I always advise C-suite executives to do is to think about their employees as kind of like built-in activists and champions, right? And if you can just empower them and let them take the lead on what they think is most important and where the company is best positioned to have an impact, I think that goes a really long way.
Absolutely. What I hear you say in both of those instances is one, active listening, and not going in with assumptions of what you think the community that you serve or the community that you are in needs, and also what employees really want to engage in and talk about and what their needs are as well. And just continually having that two-way conversation and being open to having a really dynamic strategy, and not just being performative about it and really taking action, providing the resources, and really investing in a strategy like this. And I
Yep.
know a lot of companies are just thinking about progress and how they can measure the success of once they do implement something, whether it's in the community or internally as well. And can you provide like just an example of what folks can think about when they're, I know every strategy is kind of different in terms of making an impact because it's so broad, but maybe an example of like the ROI metrics behind it and how people can really intentionally think about benchmarking and things of that nature.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's, when you get into the technical side of accountability and measurement for impact work, there are tons of opinions about how it should happen and what we should be measuring and how you draw a baseline on something like, a company's goal to maybe drive women's empowerment in a
Yeah.
specific community over a year or 5 years. Like, how are you going to go and measure that woman was empowered, right? Like,
Right.
what's the metric for that? So I think it becomes really tricky. What I will say, I've seen a few things work well when it comes to accountability and being able to point toward work that's been done. One of those things is looking at companies who are supporting the organizations that are already doing the work, right? So maybe a company decides that they care about criminal justice reform. One way to do that work would be for the company to launch an initiative run by people who work at the company to do X amount of programs over Y years, right? Another approach would be for that company to actually look out into the community, again, listen and see where are the folks who are already delivering this work. They've already got mechanisms in place for accountability. And why don't we just support them? Right. And so I think thinking about these partnerships in a really innovative way is important. I think, for all the great things that companies do well, I would go so far as to say tracking and measuring progress against impact targets is probably not high up on that list. So I very much support and try and encourage folks to look around and see who's already doing that work and support them. Um, the other thing I would say would be just thinking long term, certainly we can measure success by like the number of programs or initiatives that are launched in a year, right? But 6 months, 9 months, 12 months later, have we looked back and reflected on where the resources went and whether or not there was actually any change made? Were the intended folks who were supposed to be a part of that program or receive support from that program, were they even impacted? I think if we take a longer term view and not just so much think about the launch and the announcement of some of these big initiatives, which companies love to do, right? having that longer view, I think, starts to help people really draw out a roadmap that's reasonable, with milestones that are, realistic and that makes sense and that people can actually benchmark against.
Yeah, and to your point too, the milestones are really important just to measure the progress, but something like, achieving, women's empowerment in the community is really, it's a large and lofty goal. So I think having those realistic benchmarks is super important, and also recognizing, again, change doesn't just happen in 6 months or a year. It really does takes some time, and it takes investment and intentionality as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. And we wish, right? We wish it were as simple as like, we're going to launch the program and then the work is done. Um, and it doesn't work that way. I think last summer we saw so many corporations sort of step up and say, we care about racial justice. And what we're doing to demonstrate that we care about social and racial justice is we're writing a $5 million check to insert organization, the NAACP, Legal
Right.
Defense Fund, Black Lives Matter, whomever, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of the criticism that followed, which I think is very fair, is okay, you've written the check. Are there any Black people on your board of directors?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how's your hiring and promotions going for people of
Mhm.
color at your company? What's the retention rate? Like, all of the sort of everyday things that are not necessarily there and in place, but can be improved upon, that would really demonstrate that the company cares about racial justice.
Right.
Sometimes that stuff's not in order. And so it might be easier to say, we're going to do a press release, announce a $5 million commitment, and here we are a year later. I would love to see which companies are prepared to report back on where those dollars went.
Absolutely. We are almost at a year since a lot of companies have engaged with the anti-racism movement and supporting Black Lives Matter. And of course, the anniversary of George Floyd's murder as well, which really triggered a lot of companies to react. So I'm also interested to see where folks are at with this work with the capital W. I was listening to another one of your interviews as well. And, representation is really important. Like, you just mentioned too, on boards in leadership roles, but also if you could tell us a little bit more about, the role you see in representation in this work as well, in social impact, and in corporate social justice. I know one of the stats was 19 of the 1,800 Fortune 500 leaders were specifically Black women, which is an abysmal statistic. So what are your thoughts around representation and the importance of, having a 360 approach here?
Yeah, I mean, it's so key. It's so critical. It's we're not done yet. We're not where we should be when it comes to representation, and that's not just for Black women. That's for queer folks. That's for immigrants. That's for folks with disabilities. That's for people who identify as part of the LGBTQI community. I mean, there's a ton of work to be done, right? Where this has become so important to me is kind of the further I get along in my career and have more responsibility and therefore more influence in my role. I try to pause and think about when decisions are being made about where impact funding goes, when decisions are being made about a new employee policy, when decisions are being made about the statement that a company is going to make about current events, like who gets to be at the decision making table,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so maybe we can think about, representation at like the entry level as one indicator of where we're headed as a company. But if none of those folks are invited to the decision-making table when it's time to talk about what we do with Black History Month, when it's time to rethink our workplace policies for women and women of color, for example, then there's really no power. And I think power is what it comes down to when we're talking about representation. There's the physical presence of someone being invited into a company or a room, but then there's what they are actually in position to do. And is anyone out there willing to listen to those perspectives when they may not align with the dominant narrative or the dominant perspective? And so I think this will always kind of be something that drives me, and certainly something that for women of color, I think in the workplace, it's never not top of mind. I mean, I'm sure you've thought about, you walk into a room, am I going to be the only one here? And if I'm the only one here, right, and I decide to to share my perspective or raise my hand, how's that going to be received? And then I got to weigh like the cost benefit of being the squeaky wheel in a scenario where I think that maybe my perspective could be valuable, but again, isn't in line with the dominant. Do I want to be the squeaky wheel? Or does that kind of sacrifice some of the relationship capital that I've built up so that I can be successful at my job? I think it's this crazy calculus that we're constantly having to do. And, I am excited that we're starting to see companies care more. I'm excited that the diversity and inclusion conversation hasn't quite died yet. But we certainly don't have an answer to representation right now. And there's not a single company that I could point towards and say they're getting it right, which just means we all have more work to do.
Absolutely. Have you seen a lot of companies who are seeking out to work with you and Global Citizen kind of change the way they are approaching it over this past year throughout the pandemic? And there any like positive changes you see in like terms of engagement there?
Yeah, I think so. Change takes time, as we said, but I will say there's an appetite for it. We saw around the US presidential election in 2020, a bunch of our partner companies stood up and said, this isn't an existing policy, but we're going to actually provide paid time off for voting for all employees,
Yes.
whether you're full-time or contractors, right? Which is huge. For some of us, we don't think about those couple of hours that it would take to close the laptop and walk down or ride over to cast our vote. But for folks who are hourly workers, for folks who have children and need childcare, all of those considerations I think are valid. And so I was really kind of touched and inspired that CEOs would stand up and say, we're going to do this differently this time. And I think little by little, we'll start to see more of that. I don't think we'll see massive workplace change, in the next year. I think we're kind of still in the laying the foundation part of all of this, but I am excited when I start to see leaders who maybe 10 years ago would never have posted on their LinkedIn that they're proud that their company supports some racial justice initiative, for example. I think there's definitely been a cultural shift.
Absolutely. Do you think that there are other things that companies and especially leaders need to keep in mind as we are kind of slowly getting to this new world of work and just talking about things that were once taboo or uncomfortable and really leaning into hard conversations to really keep up with the times?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. It's occurred to me that it's possible to go through school and get a fancy MBA and work your way up to the C-suite and, kick ass in your job as a leader. And you can spend 12 or 18 months never having had lunch with a Black person. Right. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how we start to close the gaps between people.
Yeah.
Because one word that I think comes up over and over and over again as we're all navigating this pandemic is the word normal. And the reality is what's normal for me might not be normal for you. Right. So when we hear folks talk about getting back to normal or even establishing a new normal, like normal for who? Right, is the question. Like, whose norm are we building around? And so I spend a lot of time thinking about that and the ways that leaders can start to decentralize themselves and their view of what is normal, and instead kind of open themselves up to the reality of what other people are experiencing. And the primary and free way to do that is to listen, right? To go back to what we talked about earlier. So I think that's critically important. I think other things that leaders can do and maybe keep in mind is, I'm always really interested in the life that leaders live outside of the boardroom, right? And so to go back to an earlier point that I made, if there are no people of color in your neighborhood, what are you learning about these experiences? Whose perspective are you taking on? Are you really in a position to advocate, right? I see some leaders who are making it a priority to build service into their lives, into their families, so that they can keep a well-rounded perspective. And I think that's the type of leader who will come to the boardroom and be open to some really innovative approaches to making the world more equitable. I'm hoping that things kind of continue in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said a couple of different things in terms of like going back to your earlier point about power and equity, like having equity in the workplace. It really does stem from, I don't think we can compartmentalize these separate buckets of, okay, at work, I'm going to talk about social impact. I'm going to make an effort to have like this perspective and advocate for employees. But in my quote unquote personal life, I do not do that. And I don't interact with people from like a specific community or group. And there's a huge disconnect there and it does overlap. I mean, right now we're in each other's homes right now, and it's just, you can't, it's really hard to separate the personal and the professional and to really have an intentionality behind what you're doing. I think it has to be your, a concerted effort to be better, do better, to lead better. And like
That's
you
really
said,
great. That's
empathetically listen.
yeah, for sure.
I'm sure there are many, but one of the questions that I also wanted to ask you too is in your kind of line of work, I'm sure, like we said, many times change doesn't happen overnight, but whether it's a small or big way, what is one of your kind of most proud moments, either working at Global Citizen or in another kind of role where you were in that moment of flow, thinking that this is the work I was supposed to be in, and I'm really happy because of XYZ?
Yeah. Um, Gosh, let me think. What are really those kind of like peak flow moments for me? Um, so I will say, since it's publicly been announced now or by now, I have worked really hard with our team at Global Citizen over the past 6 to 8 months to build a relationship with a sports league that is a long, long ways away from being equitable and fair and even thoughtful about diversity. Um,
Mhm.
and that league is Formula One, and they have a legacy of being, a very, very rich white male European
That's
sport,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Not a household sport for me growing up,
Yeah.
surprise. And yet they have a real appetite for change, and most importantly, they recognize that if they are to be relevant in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if they're going to expand and kind of grow into new markets where there are people who look like you and me, they have to show up, right, in a really honest and authentic way about who they've been. And so this has been such an exciting project for me to work on because I feel like I really get to roll up my sleeves and kind of look at the brand identity of F1 and try to pull out where I know they're having an impact, and then also create like a really realistic pathway for them to get on track with some of the racial justice work that we see happening in the world, with some of the work around gender equality that's happening in the world. I think that they will get there, but they're certainly not, a perfect organization. And they're certainly not who I would pick as the sports league that's best positioned to have, a good impact in the world. But I have a ton of faith in them. And I've just been really impressed by their leadership and their willingness and their humility to kind of start from where they are. I wish we could see more companies and more leaders kind of start by, being really humble. Like these are the hiccups that we've experienced. These are things we wish we would have done differently, and we want to set a different course. I think it's a very vulnerable position to be in as a leader, right? To talk about where your brand maybe falls short. But it's work that I think is so important, not just from a social impact standpoint, but even just for the life of the brand. And it gives me like the warm and fuzzies.
Yes, absolutely. It is not too late. It is not too late
Not
to
too
just really
late.
acknowledge that you want to do this work and there is a problem and you are actively fixing it. You're actively working on it. It's a journey. Everybody's in a different part of the journey, but I think if you have this intention, if you have these goals and you really put teeth behind what you are saying and are authentic,
Yeah.
like you said, actively listening and bringing in experts and really listening to folks who are in the space, I think that is really important. So I think that's a great.
Yeah. And it's that difference in approach between F1's going to write a check to Black Lives Matter, which they haven't, they didn't,
Mhm.
versus we're going to make a longer term investment in who we are as a brand, right? And we're going to work with organizations that are already doing the work. And we're going to take the critical feedback about how we show up and who's
Mhm.
invited to be a part of the sport. And I had never been a motorsport fan.
Same
In the
here.
past couple of months have like brought myself up to speed. And now I'm like fully invested, and I can't wait to see what the driver lineup looks like in 5 years and in 10 years. So I think it's going to be very, very different. And is it kind of niche? Sure. I think F1 and motorsport, they're a little bit niche if you know, you know. But again, I think setting an example for the rest of the world, right? On like, even as a sports league, you can have a major impact. I think that's really powerful.
Absolutely. They would be a great example. And also, they have visibility to a community as well. That's really important to really have this message and really show that they are doing the internal and external work to really, keep up with the times and also, again, acknowledge, act, and continue to listen with a dynamic approach to
That's right.
what they're doing. So
That's
I love to hear that. What is one of, the most rewarding parts of the job that you have?
Oh man. My background is in international development. And so I studied it at NYU. My first kind of work project was overseas. I was in India working in very rural kind of villages and communities where there's, little to no access to education, no clean drinking water,
Mhm.
electricity 20% of the time, that kind of an environment. And in the work that I do now, I think I draw a lot of satisfaction from it because Global Citizens' mission to end extreme poverty includes those folks who I met when I was living and working out in the field, right? And so I think for me to have the opportunity to be at an organization and in a position where I have like a full global view of what it means to be disempowered, what it means to live under systemic oppression, what it means to lack human rights and basic access to things that we all need, like Wi-Fi, right? Being
Mhm.
able to sit in my seat and kind of see all of that and then work with brands and sort of steer where they come in, like it kind of feels like I'm a pilot in a cockpit, right? And it's like that feeling of like, holy shit, there's so much work to do. But if I can just get this thing right over here and this thing right over here, I think those are wins, right? So I love the size of the challenges that I get to work on. I love that my work is global in nature, and I hope
Yep.
that's something that I can always maintain because culture is so exciting to me. And I really just love ultimately being in a role where I know that there's someone on the other side whose life is going to be positively impacted by the hours that I'm putting in at my laptop. And I think that that's super special. And I know it's not everyone's experience. So I try not to take that for granted.
Absolutely. And you are tackling these huge issues. So it's good to hear that there are like really rewarding aspects too, where it is like you are putting in all these hours, like you said, in your laptop and planning meetings and just doing all of the things, but it is really impacting people's day to day lives. And to have that experience, like you said, like on the ground, grassroots is super important to have that holistic perspective as well.
Yeah, I feel really lucky to be able to do that.
Do you have any advice for people who are either internally working at an organization in like a social impact office or who are working at other organizations who are really trying to work in the private sector and make a difference? Like you said, I think brands have a really interesting space that they're in to kind of have a voice and just, again, partner with organizations as well who are doing the work. Any advice for folks who are either leading initiatives at their companies and just are looking for best practices there?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few bits of advice. The first is if you're leading an initiative at your company that is ultimately to make the workplace culture better in whatever way, I believe that there should be resources there for you, whether that's funding, whether that's support from executives. I encourage folks oftentimes, like, don't do the work in a vacuum or in a silo.
Yeah.
Open yourself up, make it very clear the change that you're trying to create, and then ask for the resources that you need, whether that's to host an event, whether that's to hire, an expert to come in and do kind of a working session, like whatever that looks like and whatever your team or your company's needs are. I would say be very, very clear and vocal about the resources that you need. And the other thing I would say is, thinking about the importance of partnerships and really working together. We all go farther when we work together, right? We go farther faster. And so, finding either pockets of folks at your company who are doing similar work, even if it's not the same exact work, right? That can become a really powerful kind of coalition. Then I think looking across even your industry, whether that's tech or education or fashion. I mean, I think a lot of industries are kind of undergoing transformation from a workplace culture standpoint right now. And so it's a really great time to start to reach out and say, all right, so where are the other lesbians in fashion, for example? Like, how can we build together, right? Where are the other single moms in tech? Like, how can we build together and support each other? I think really beautiful things happen that way when we start to focus on building community and building that base of power, and then thinking about what we can achieve versus focusing on how are we going to accomplish X without that base of power and support.
Yeah, and I think that is also a relieving feeling to feel like you are not alone. There is a community of people out there, and it might take a little additional work to just find the folks who are in your corner, but also who are doing the work and have been doing the work for many years or just started. But I think it's really important to lean on people, ask for help, and identify areas
I'm
where you
so
need
glad
to
you
learn.
said that, because I do think it's it's something we don't talk about enough, is the emotional toll that it takes for us to be fighting for equity and justice in the organizations that we work in, right? There is a cost. And I think for myself, when it's just me going at something and I feel like I don't have that support, burnout happens in a matter of like 48 hours. And I'm like, I need a nap. Like, I've had enough. I'll
Yes.
with myself next week, right? Like, it's heavy, it's a lot. But when I've got other folks involved, when it's not all on me, suddenly it takes a little bit longer to get to burnout, right? Because we have each other, we energize each other. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I don't think it's top of mind, even for us who care and are super passionate about creating change in the workplace. I don't think we always remember to stop and take a moment to consider the emotional and the mental toll that it takes to not only do your job well, but to do your job well in an environment that you think could be better for people like you. That's tough, tough, tough work. And it is not in your job description. And those overtime hours count for nothing on your pay, right? So it comes from a place of passion. And, you know, my friends and I sometimes joke when it comes to people of color in the workplace being asked to lead diversity and inclusion initiatives. It's like, great, more unpaid labor for people of color, right?
Yeah, it's a full-time job.
But we do it because we care, right? And I think my hope is that we have the time and the space and the energy to care for each other as we build and as we try to create better work environments for everyone.
I 110% agree with that as well. It's a heavy weight on your shoulders just to think about, especially if you're the only, director of diversity inclusion, you're the only director of social impact, or you are an employee resource group leader who, again, that's additional labor, but you're doing it because you care. I think that's a really relatable feeling to have, especially as someone who is personally tied to the work. I know that we have discussed a lot here, but if there's anything else that you would like to share with folks who are listening about you or your experience, and anything, that we didn't cover that you would like to share.
I mean, I think the other thing that those of us who care about inclusion and are actively doing this work, the other thing we don't hear often enough is thank you, right? And so, like, I want to extend a very, very literal and figurative thank you to everyone who commits to doing this work every day, because it is often unpaid. It is often thankless. And when I have conversations with the elders in my life, with women who I admire, and mentors, I often have these moments of them saying things like, when I was your age in my career, I couldn't wear my natural hair. It just wasn't allowed at work. And it blows my mind, right? But someone had to do that. Someone had to show up at work looking like this in order for it to be okay. And so I take those instances as reminders that even though in the short term, I may not see the critical change that I'm working for, in the aggregate and in the long term, we can be certain that there are folks who will benefit from the work that we're putting in now. And so I would say it's thankless, but hold each other up, hold each other down, like really, really look out for and care for one another, because the amount of energy that it takes to change systems is massive. It's massive. And I don't think that we even appreciate ourselves in that work sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think that is a really important message. So you're right that not a lot of people hear or say enough or just say externally too, because we're so in the weeds of all of the work that we're doing for this massive change, like you mentioned. So thank you so much for carving out the space to have this conversation.
Sure.
It was so nice to meet you, Pilar. And I am really excited to keep in touch with you and just see all of the incredible work that you're doing.
Amazing. Well, thank you for having me. And thank you again to the work that you do in the communities that you're building and a part of. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate it as well. And thank you to our viewers for listening here today as well. As a reminder, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees speaking up and think that it is a requirement in order for everyone to succeed at your organization. So we will speak later and stay safe.